Shortly, we'll be starting to read Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was written in Britain in 1886. It's called a novella because it's shorter than a novel, but longer than a short story. One of the main topics you'll be exploring in your final essay is how the culture and time period within which a literary work is created can shape and influence the themes, ideas, characters, and even plot of that literary work. Thus, before you begin reading, I'd like to take some time to introduce you to the time period within which Stevenson's novella was written. The Victorian Period. I would recommend that you take some notes while watching this presentation. The Victorian period lasted from 1837 to 1901. So why do we call this span of 64 years the Victorian period? Quite simply, because this was when Queen Victoria reigned as monarch of Great Britain. Victoria came to the throne when she was only 18 years old. You can see a picture of her here as a young queen in 1843. She remained in power throughout the 19th century. In fact, until recently in 2015, when Queen Elizabeth II took on the title, Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history. Victoria is an important figure to start with because in many ways she reflected how the Victorians wanted to see themselves and what they valued. Here are some of the values reflected by Victoria. These values are duty, propriety, productivity, stability or continuity, and being a world power. As you read Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, pay attention to how these values like the value of doing your duty or maintaining respectability, which is what propriety means, influence various characters' actions or beliefs. In terms of Great Britain being a world power, it's important to note that the empire of this very little nation stretched across the world by the end of the 19th century. Here's a picture of the British Empire near the close of the 19th century. This particular image was used as advertising material by a firm that made biscuits at the time. Great Britain itself is the tiny red spot in the middle of the map off the coast of France and Germany. However, everything else in red was also part of the British Empire by the end of the 19th century. This second map makes the area that belonged to Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, as you can see it on the map here, a little bit easier to see. As you can see, British influence had spread across the globe, and Victoria was Empress of India as well as Queen of Britain, Canada, the biggest country in the empire, and small countries such as Jamaica. Trade with the empire helped to make Britain rich. Although there were many monetary motivations for imperialism, a big part of the imperial project was to help or civilize more primitive, as the British believed them to be, cultures. Based, of course, on the belief that the British were better than these more primitive cultures. This is important because these concerns about primitivism and helping the less fortunate also informed class relations in England, something that we'll be paying attention to within the novella. First, let me break down what I mean by class. In Victorian British society, there were three main classes: the elite class, the middle class, and the working or lower class. First, the elite class. This class included aristocrats, so those with noble titles like Duke or Duchess, and gentry, rich, landowning members of the upper class who weren't necessarily part of the nobility itself. Members of this class generally didn't need to work because they had inherited land, money, and often noble titles. They were usually expected to serve in Parliament, though, and Parliament is just the group of people in Britain who, along with the monarch, were responsible for making the laws. One little tip I give you is to pay attention to what MP stands for. MP stands for Member of Parliament, and you should pay attention to who is referred to as an MP on page 53 in Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The second class I want to discuss is the middle class. This class spanned a wide range from upper to lower middle class. So, for example, a prestigious lawyer with upper class clients versus a lowly clerk. Members of this class usually worked, but their jobs would have mostly fallen into the category of what we would consider white-collar jobs today. The upper middle class, a class that we'll really be paying attention to as we read Jekyll and Hyde, consisted of professionals, like higher status doctors and lawyers and clergymen in the Church of England, who would have gone to a university to study these professions. Members of the upper middle class had often inherited money, just like members of the elite class. Finally, we come to the working or lower class, as they were sometimes called. The working or lower class consisted of people who did manual labor or served other people. This included factory workers, farm hands, and servants. So, for example, maids, butlers, cooks, etc. Most members of this class had very little money and worked paycheck to paycheck. They generally lived in crummier neighborhoods in London, like Soho or Whitechapel. Here's another tip as you're reading. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Pay attention for which character lives in Soho. The one-page optional reading, Class Structure in Victorian England, which can be found in the Essay 4 Materials folder, reviews and goes over these ideas in a bit more detail. So how does this class breakdown connect to the ideas of primitivism and helping the less fortunate that I mentioned earlier? In part, discussions of class relations and primitivism connected because of the belief in something called degeneration. Let me back up a little and explain what I mean. The theory of evolution as we know it arose during the Victorian period. Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species in 1859. You can see the cover page here. This is the work that proposed the theory of natural selection and that humans and apes shared a common ancestor, though we ended up following different evolutionary paths. As the belief in evolutionary theory grew, a belief also arose in the possibility of degeneration. So what's degeneration? Essentially, degeneration meant de-evolution, a movement backwards towards a more primitive, less evolved human. Here we can see one example of these beliefs about degeneration from the time. These quotes, which can be found in the back of your Broadview edition of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, are from a work written in the same year as Jekyll and Hyde by a man named J. Milner Fothergill. Fothergill was a prestigious medical writer and member of the College of Physicians. Here's what he has to say about degeneration. Assuming the Norse to be the highest type of mankind, we find the town dweller to be a reversion to an earlier and lowlier ethnic form. While the rustic remains an Anglo-Dane, his cousin in London is smaller and darker, showing a return to the Celto-Iberian race. He also says, in the true-bred Cockney of the East End, the most degenerate Cockney, we can see a return to an earlier, archaic type of man. Mr. Kentley made careful observations and measurements of several Cockneys. He says of one, height 5 feet, 3 inches. His jaws are misshapen. He cannot bring his front teeth within half an inch of each other. His upper jaw is pointed and falls within the arch of the lower. It would seem that the Cockney, reared under unfavorable circumstances, manifests a decided reversion to an earlier and lowlier ethnic form. If you look at the parts highlighted in red, you can really see Fothergill's belief that humankind could de-evolve and revert to an earlier, smaller, less evolved form. His reference to lowlier ethnic forms, and to this lowlier ethnic form as darker, also reveals the same racist beliefs that informed much of British imperialism as well. Something you can also see here is another very class-based belief prominent at the time. This belief, which was common among the same white upper and middle class British citizens who felt it was their responsibility to civilize the rest of the world, was that the lower classes living in terrible conditions in inner city slums were the ones most likely to show signs of degeneration. That's who Father Gill is referring to when he talks about the Cockney of the East End. These same mostly white upper and middle class citizens also thought that criminals were examples of degeneration. And yes, that is where we get our current usage of calling someone who we consider to be a thug or a criminal a degenerate. Plus, they often equated these two groups, poor people and criminals. All of these beliefs would have been ideas that Robert Louis Stevenson was familiar with as he composed Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Whether Stevenson agrees with all of these beliefs, disagrees with them, or just plays with them in his novella to scare the reading public is an open question. But they undoubtedly inform what happens in the novella, the way some characters are described, and the themes that come up. So, as you read, I want you to pay special attention to several things. Number 1, the different classes to which characters belong and how their class status might affect characters' behaviors or interactions. Number 2, places where characters are described as primitive or animalistic or less than human. And number 3, places where characters seem to be acting based on Victorian values related to doing your duty or maintaining respectability, or where they're acting against these values. For information on how to cite this presentation in your essays, check out the document on citing this video and the video introduction to the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This document can be found in the Essay 4 Materials folder.